When it comes to the show don't tell rule in fiction writing, some people say that the evolution of a writer usually goes a little something like this. Beginners tell too much. They get told over and over by their writing instructors, their writing coaches, their beta readers, come on, you need to show, don't tell. And then amateurs probably start to show too much. They no longer tell anything. So everything's probably a little bit over-described. And then professionals start to know when to tell and when to show. The show don't tell rule is one that you have no doubt, even if you're a beginner at writing, you have heard this. Because if you can think of kind of that stereotypical writing coach or writing instructor advice, what would it be? It would definitely be show, don't tell. But so many writers get really panicked and a little traumatized by this rule, right? You think to yourself, okay, am I doing this right? How do I do it? And then, am I doing it enough or too much? And that's a problem because sometimes there are times when telling might be better than showing. So I thought that in this episode of the How to Be an Author podcast, we would talk about some of the little rules and advice about showing, not telling. Because telling too much becomes super expository, it becomes a little dull, but sometimes the showing can create this overblown, overworked, bloated description that readers tend to skip over as well. You want your writing to be evocative. You want it to sing. You want it to be immersive. So in this episode, we're going to be talking about how best to balance that showing versus telling so that your book is actually having your readers have the optimal reading experience. Immersive, engaging, but not slowed down. You want your pacing to keep working as well. So let's dive right into this show don't tell episode of the How to Be an Author podcast. If you're a writer dreaming of becoming a successful author, join me, writing coach Karena Akhavein, on the How to Be an Author podcast, your weekly source for writing information, inspiration, and motivation. Welcome back. I think that show don't tell is one of those rules that is only as devastating as something like writers write every day. Many times this rule can be completely misunderstood, misquoted, and misappropriated, and then writers end up getting into trouble. The most confusing aspects of the show don't tell rule in fiction typically involve knowing when to use descriptive language and when to let actions and dialogue speak for themselves. It can be really challenging to strike the right balance between showing and telling, especially if you're a newer writer, but also if you're a writer who's in the process of leveling up. Like, let's say you're going from being an amateur to somebody who's trying to become more of a professional. You really don't want to get tripped up when it comes to how to conveying emotions, motivations, and complex ideas. So knowing when to show, not tell, and how to do it right requires a lot of practice, a lot of feedback, and a good understanding of storytelling techniques. So why do so many authors struggle so much with this show don't tell rule? Well, it does require this overall nuanced understanding of how storytelling works. So as an author, one of your main jobs is to convey information effectively. We are actually in the business of magic, turning ideas and images into these words that then get retranslated for your reader into the image or the idea that you had in mind. It's such a fascinating alchemy. It doesn't always work the way we think it would, but the better you get at it, the more perfectly you're able to convey your ideas, and the more certain you can be that your reader is actually going to be absorbing those ideas in the way you intended. So remember that writing is a skill that improves with practice. Mastering the art of showing rather than telling takes time and experience. If you haven't had enough practice or feedback to develop this skill, don't worry if you're not doing it perfectly yet. This is something that doesn't happen overnight. Many authors get so scared that when they're showing something instead of just telling readers straight out, the readers might be confused or unsure as to what is happening. So they resort to telling to ensure the clarity because they're afraid of the ambiguity. They're afraid of not saying what they mean. And as they do that, that could sacrifice depth and immersion, or it can create pacing issues because your narrative becomes a little bit bloated. And one of the big things that I do when I'm kind of doing a little editorial assessment of your writing, for example, which is one of the services I do as a writing coach, one of the things that I will do is I will point out to writers those places where they are missing some clarity, where they're missing some of the key information that the reader needs. Now, your reader's smart. They don't need absolutely everything told to them, nor do they need it. Their brain's going to fill in the blanks. But there's some things that are non-negotiable. And with experience, you start to see those little plot holes or those, holes in your description, for example, where your reader's not getting the clarity. And then you start to see the places where you've over-described the coffee mug your character is drinking from, and you've told us far too much about their emotional state when you could have just shown it in a few well-chosen details. So over-reliance on exposition is so common for writers, especially when you're conveying this information that you feel is really important, like backstory, character traits, and world building. This really is something where when you're using these direct statements, instead of integrating the information organically into the narrative, you're doing what your writing coach will call info dumping. And info dumping is not what we like because it pulls the reader out of the story. You want your story to be immersive. You want your reader to be completely diving into it. So the goal is for them to barely realize that they're reading anymore and just to be in it. So if you're doing this huge expository section, your reader is now very conscious that they are reading information, and that's not what you want. Telling, of course, allows authors to have more control over the narrative and ensure that readers interpret it as intended, but this can definitely stifle the creativity for your reader and limit their engagement with the text. So remember that, and just keep determining what's important for you to have them. Know verbatim, exactly the way you intended, and where can you be a little bit more open in interpretation. Right? You don't have to explain absolutely everything. Trust that reader. And also sometimes when you're writing something, especially when you've created a whole backstory for yourself and you really know your characters in and out, I find that writers kind of underestimate their ability to put in these little tiny cues that are super subtle, that are almost in there that they did subliminally themselves. And it really helps your reader to draw conclusions that you want them to draw. So that's pretty fascinating. Trust yourself a little bit, that after some practice and after some feedback, you're going to be developing an ability to show rather than tell in a way that is way more subtle than you might think. So let's get into a little bit more detail on how to do this showing, not telling thing in your novel. First of all, sensory details. You no doubt have heard this. Instead of telling readers that, my character is feeling sad, describe their physical reactions and surroundings to convey the emotion. The tears welling up in their eyes, the rain-soaked window. I know that that's a little bit of a cliche, but you know what? We're hardwired to understand cliches. Some things in the room that are mirroring your character's mood. These things are going to be great ways to convey their emotions. But of course, I talked about the cliche. I talked about this overblown thing. Yes, that's a danger too. Many times when newer writers are using sensory details, they are following something that is a bit of a cliche. They're using something like, how many times can you talk about tears welling up in your character's eyes? How much of a crybaby are they? So know when you've overused the same sensory detail over and over in your work. It happens to the best of us. So that's something really crucial. If you're looking at your book and you've got, 20 places where your characters displaying their emotion in the same way, start to tweak a little bit. Remember that actions can speak louder than words. What your characters do in response to their emotions or to situations is really crucial and can convey how they're feeling. So you don't need to say he was nervous. You can say he was tapping his foot, avoiding eye contact, his palms were sweaty. But again, remember that if he's got sweaty palms, 20 times in your book, somebody's going to be thinking, wow, this character has a palm sweat problem. But I said actions speak louder than words. Well, dialogue really does speak pretty loudly as well. Allowing characters to reveal their thoughts, feelings, and motivations through dialogue is a really effective technique. Dialogue can show conflict, tension, or feelings through what the characters say and how they say them rather than telling the readers explicitly. You don't have to say she was angry. You can say, "Go screw yourself," she told her boyfriend, something like that. And this heated exchange is going to replace your need to say she was angry. And I was talking about vivid descriptions. Having this descriptive, immersive language is going to also show kind of the feeling that the environment is giving your characters who are sitting in that environment. So if you have this beautiful day and, your character's sitting in this glorious scene, describing that, unless you tell us different, we're going to assume that your character is feeling quite good in this type of scene, right? Unless you want to subvert that by having the contrast between the scene and how they feel. And that too is a really effective way of showing rather than telling. One of the major things I tell my writers is that your characters are never static within your book. And so character development is one of those really crucial elements to create a satisfying read. And too many times, newer writers are going to be telling the reader that, Susie had become more confident. No. Show Susie taking bold actions. Show Susie speaking up in a challenging situation. That's going to be a much better way of showing rather than telling. But again, you want to avoid this exposition, right? So you definitely want to do the subtle hints that are scattered throughout the narrative. So let's say that you're trying to say that Susie has gotten much more confident. You're not going to show us this overblown thing where she's acting all super confident and bold all in one place. You're wanting to give us about 3 or more smaller, subtle hints scattered throughout the narrative so that we're organically seeing how she's changing. So definitely trust those readers. Again, they're going to be picking up on those cues, especially if you have enough of them, especially if they're sprinkled throughout. Let's say they miss something. That's fine. They're going to pick up on the next little bit, and you still don't need to spell it all out for them. But again, the mastering the show don't tell technique, this takes practice. So you need to revise your writing. You need to be seeking opportunities to replace some of your telling with showing and get that beta reader feedback so that you know that you're doing it right. And that's going to help your audience so much. So remember, telling would be the woman sat in the chair waiting for her boyfriend to come home. She was anxious, wondering where he was and why he was late. She absentmindedly petted her cat as she stared out the window. Okay, that's a lot of telling, but there's a little bit of showing there, I find, too. But now look at the opposite one, which is the woman sank into the warm armchair, her fingers drumming nervously on the armrest as she gazed out the window. Outside, the streetlights flickered to life, casting long shadows across the room. With each passing minute, her heart fluttered faster in her chest, her thoughts consumed by the absence of her boyfriend. She absent-mindedly stroked the fur of her tabby cat, feeling the comforting rhythm of its purring against her palm. Each passing car outside made her pulse quicken, anticipation and worry intertwining in her mind like a tangled knot. Okay, you see how that's a little bit overblown. So you're probably aiming for something between those two, because over description is a massive problem, almost as bad as telling the whole way. And I want to insert a little something here, which is that different genres have different expectations, by the way, in the whole balance between the showing, not telling. I find that a lot of romance, for example, will have both. And in romance, you will have much more overblown description of emotions or situations. You've got writers kind of slowing things down so you really get into the character's mind. And there's no doubt about how obsessed they are with their love interest, for example. So remember that you need to look at your genre conventions and the expectations that your readers are going to have within your genre. If you have questions about the genre expectations and conventions, you're going to want to check out last week's podcast episode because I talk all about that in some detail, and that can be really helpful, especially when you're hoping to write a book that is more easily marketable. I'm going to take the time here to tell you that if you have been considering taking my masterclass from idea to published in 6 months, you're going to want to jump on that really quickly because that class is getting reworked. It's been filling up. A lot of writers have been taking advantage, and I'm going to need to make that class a much more premium item because I'm integrating a lot more office hours into that. So you're going to be wanting to jump on it now before the price starts to reflect the amount of time that I am putting into this course. And also, as my own writing career is absolutely blowing up, I can actually guarantee that the techniques, methods, and hacks that I teach you in this course, they work because they're working on me. I'm just a little bit further down the road than you might be. And that's kind of a great mentor, I think. Not somebody who's the end all be all know it all. It's somebody who has been there, done that, and knows that what they're telling you probably is going to work for you and wants to work with you. So definitely check my website, creativeandwritingcoach.com, and online courses for writers, and consider taking that masterclass if you're serious about your book coming out in the next 6 months while you protect your mindset and build your author platform. Okay, let's jump into some of the biggest mistakes that writers make when trying to show, not tell, over description. As I was saying, too much detail can overwhelm readers. As I said, it slows down the pacing of the story. So focus on selecting the most essential details to create that vivid imagery without bogging down the narrative. This is where you go through and you go, this detail is a little bit cliche. Let me find something more subtle and more quick that's going to be that much more evocative. Lack of subtlety is a huge mistake in newer authors. Being too explicit in that showing, it's super heavy-handed and overblown, kind of like that passage that I just read. It's a little bit much. It lacks nuance and it's not subtle enough. It's almost spelling things out just as much as telling the whole entire thing. Also, forced dialogue. I'd said that dialogue's a powerful tool, but forced or unnatural dialogue where you're trying to shove all this information in, it can feel really contrived. So when you're striving to make your dialogue authentic and believable, you need to kind of keep it low key. I find that that's really important. I was just editing one of my own books last night. I was going through the dialogue and seeing, you know what? These characters are trying to talk about too many things and trying to express too many things and too many emotions in a single dialogue. And actually, sometimes it's okay to take out some of it. It actually makes for a better read. You're not taking out layers. You're actually just letting your reader experience more of what you meant. And you're not removing from them as you pare things down. I promise. You're letting them dive in deeper. There are things that are external when you're talking about, showing, but there's also stuff that is internal, right? So many writers are going to show all these external actions and reactions, but they neglect to delve into characters' internal thoughts and emotions. And then things start to feel a little bit shallow. So remember to use a combination of external and internal cues when you are creating this description of how your character is feeling, how they are, how they're changing, all of that. Now, language is really important, but relying too heavily on your vocabulary, your adverbs, your adjectives, and, whipping out that thesaurus and trying to convey these emotions in such a different way, this actually can weaken the impact of your writing. You should be choosing strong verbs and precise language to show rather than tell. Of course, the well-placed adjective or adverb could be amazing. Ignore that writing advice where they say, oh my God, never use adverbs. They often attribute this advice to somebody like, Stephen King or Mark Twain. But I think that this advice is often misquoted, probably. Adverbs once in a while are awesome, but you don't need to use them all the time, right? Because when you say, she said this angrily, well, then you are not writing your dialogue right. Because if your reader needs to know that someone said something angrily, well, then the sentence you just wrote in that dialogue is wasted. So remember that you don't want to be mega redundant in what you're writing. And so many times, in an effort to avoid telling, some writers swing too far in the opposite direction and they neglect to provide any exposition or explanation at all. They're just diving into the scenes and they're showing. But there are times when telling is necessary to maintain clarity and coherence. Don't worry, we're going to be talking about those times. When I see my writers struggling with that white room syndrome where, they're jumping into a scene and I have no idea where in the world they are, a simple the next morning, would really help. And yeah, I know that's telling, but that's telling that's necessary. Remember that consistency is kind of important too, by the way. You want to keep balancing your showing and telling throughout your book. You want to strive to maintain a consistent narrative voice and style. You want to be avoiding these sudden shifts between showing and telling. I have some writers, it's really funny. It feels like when you're squeezing a tube of toothpaste and it's not coming out and all of a sudden it all comes out. So they will be writing something that's just this completely lyrical description of a scene. And then all of a sudden they realize, oh no, I'm running out of words and nothing's happened yet. And so all of a sudden we have this blob of telling that catches us up to where we should be. And no, it would be better if you fixed it so that it was kind of consistent, where you're weaving things in. Writing is weaving. Remember that. Now, okay, I was talking about when is telling more appropriate than showing. There are certain circumstances where brevity, clarity, and emphasis are essential. There are many different situations like this, but here are a few. First of all, passages of time. You cannot be writing your book in real time. If you were doing that, it would take us 20 years to read a book, right? You can't be Marcel Proust. So if you're summarizing time passages, I think it's really important to condense that time, especially for transitions between scenes or to skip over uneventful periods. You need to tell us. You need to say months passed as Sarah's skills as a swords person improves steadily. Okay, fine. Now we know that she's been practicing. You don't have to show us every practice session during those months. Sometimes also when you're providing background information, when you want to do this quickly, because it's important sometimes that information, I always say, give us the information at the point at which we need it. And many authors tell me, and rightly so, well, how do I do that when we need it? If we need it, if it's in a really exciting spot, aren't I going to ruin my pacing? Correct. That's why you don't do lengthy descriptions. You can say, having grown up in a small town, Sarah felt blah. Instead of telling us, a whole description of growing up, right? That lasts for 10 paragraphs. We can just get that important information out and then move on. Sometimes internal thoughts or reflections are really important, right? But sometimes a direct statement is going to convey a character's state of mind more effectively. So instead of spending a whole paragraph telling me, all these different traits and, thought patterns and, trembling and ruminating, just tell me that she realized she made a terrible mistake. Just tell me that. And then let's move on. And then you can actually reinforce that with a little description of how she feels about it. But we don't need to keep going into it if she's feeling this way, but now we need to move on because this is going to actually inform the next plot point, right? You don't want to have your description be taking away from plot, i.e. what is happening. And that's where people say that the action verbs and the actions are just as important, if not more so, than this description in conveying things. It's because in books, things happen. That's the difference between books and real life. In real life, sometimes nothing much happens. Well, in a book, if that's the case, and I've gotten some pushback on this, but I still believe this, you want things to happen or else your reader is going to get a little bit bored. And again, when transitioning between scenes, crucial to tell me how many days have passed. How have we moved geographically? How do we get from this scene to that scene? I don't want this jump where I'm like, I don't know if this is tomorrow or next year. You need to know. And also setting the tone or atmosphere. Sometimes it's okay to say the air was thick with tension and then move on because I don't want to focus on that. As long as I know that that's existing, I don't need a blown up description of how thick How tense? All these metaphors to tell me that, there's tension in the room. So while showing is generally preferred, telling definitely has its place. So make sure that you ask your beta readers if you're doing it right. Reach out to your writing coach. I would love to hear from you. Send me an email. You can find me on my website, creativeandwritingcoach.com, or onlineCoursesForWriters.com. And I would love to be instrumental in your writing success. Learning that fine balance of showing and telling is one of the crucial steps, and it's not as hard as you think. So if you want some more in-depth learning on this subject, you definitely want to consider signing up with me, your writing coach. In the course, you're going to be getting workbook exercises that will help you to hone this skill so well. It's going to be well worth your time and effort. It's going to pay off in so many ways. Thank you so much for joining me on the How to Be an Author podcast. I look forward to being with you next time as we delve into more writing tips, tricks, hacks, and everything you need to level up as an author. If you have any pressing writing-related questions or would like to be featured on the How to Be an Author podcast, please feel free to reach out on my website, creativeandwritingcoach.com.